half pages long, roughly. And Ken works through several theological objections in there. He works through theological argument from what we've already been talking about and what we'll talk about even this week, and connecting it specifically to wording that we see carried through the Bible. I mentioned this last week that most Christians I know don't argue that babies go to hell at all, like period. They would say that all babies, infants, babies in utero, um, potentially even toddlers up to, as we'll get to that, an age of some age, wherever that cutoff might be. But they are going to hopefully anticipate the all babies are going to heaven. So the 60 some million babies just in America in recent history that have been aborted would all be in heaven. And so Ken walks through what do we do about election? How do we understand that? What do we do with the transmission of sin nature? How do we wrestle with that? And how are we theologically making this argument, not just emotionally making the argument? And I think that's important. I think it's very easy to make the emotional argument. And so that's why I left. Anticipate reading that this Bondage of the Will, and this week we want to continue that discussion leading up to
there's a all of these things we've been discussing throughout the study are connected together, dependent upon one another. Especially the later weeks are dependent upon the early ones. But this week is, and I about total depravity last week, so we're starting out with that. So you did print these out and hand them out. Um,
we can walk through it kind of generically, looking at the first section, um, kind of trying to understand what do we mean by an unregenerate person, and how has sin affected the person in their unregenerate state before salvation. And so as we look at that, is there anything there where, hey, this statement popped out to me, or this was a helpful wording?
yes, I believe he's retired, but he was very much one of the people relied upon by most. Well, I can't really say most Baptists.
He taught for a while up at Piper's College and Seminary.
Chesterville, there's a large Grace Church. What was it called? I don't deacons or whatever they were, but they were men being trained for leadership. And there was this rather large group of them. They all were
Survival.
that was the text for the. Also, my own story. When I first became extremely interested in theology and was continually bringing questions to my pastor in Lane Avenue Korean Baptist Church, he gave me his copy of Christian Theology. I guess he sort of got tired of all the questions, and he says, "Here, you read it," and so I did. So, in fact, I've read a few different theology books, and I've never agreed with everything anybody has said. If you read somebody like if you read all the way through and you find you've agreed with him on everything, then you probably should read it again. But anyway, I think he's useful, so we've used him here.
As we jump into the beginning here, just to, again, to bring in the practical side of this, this past week, and if you're interested, I'll show you the video. I saw just a clip of a service, a church service where a guest speaker was inviting the congregation to consider that God actually worships us. Okay, you still a part of it too, Jeremy. And then in the benediction, the hosting pastor makes the declaration that God worships us. And as I was chatting about it with my pastor friends, I think it comes back to this kind of conversation, that we don't actually understand our creatureliness. We don't understand our wickedness. We don't understand how separate and other we are from God. The God is so far and beyond our comprehension and even our imagination, that our sin has separated us so far. My father-in-law used to say it's not like we have a scale and like you're down here and God's way up here, and like you got some of the way, but like you didn't really get there. He's like, no. He's like, it's not that you're on the same ground. That you're not even allowed.
Goes back to his holiness and his purity,
Yes.
and the fact that because he is holy and pure, he can have nothing to do with depravity.
Right.
Because of that,
Bondage of the will and noetic effect of sin. Well, I would say noetic effect of sin is seen right there in that guy's statement. That his mind is so corrupted by sin that he would consider that the Creator would worship his creation, which is completely opposite.
Right, and that's
of Romans
absolutely
1.
blasphemous.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And so we have a responsibility to try to understand enough of God's word that when somebody says something blasphemous, we don't feel right about that. We say, wait a minute, I got to go back to Scripture, read that, or you might know right away that's not working, like in this case. But there are other things that are not quite so easily detected, you know, the prosperity gospel. I mean, they'll quote scripture left and right saying how. So it's definitely worthwhile to study scripture and to try to learn these precepts behind it. So are we all clear about total depravity affecting every part of us as far as we are sinful?
I have one quote from Erickson.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Start before it gives more context. It says there are genuinely altruistic, unregenerate persons who show kindness, generosity, and love others, who are good, devoted spouses and parents. Some completely secular persons have engaged in acts of heroism on behalf of their country. These actions, insofar as they are in conformity with God's will and law, are pleasing to God, though not in any way meritorious. So how is this that those things are pleasing to God? I wasn't so sure about that.
Well, pleasing but not meritorious. So that's kind of an important line.
Yeah, well, I get that he's making a distinction, but I think of like where he says their works are like filthy rags, like that in no way sounds pleasing. And then I think of like Psalm 51 where it
Because I would also default then back to what Ken was just saying, that we all have areas where we would disagree with their wording or how people look and say things. I think you could say it this way. It's quite possible that your coworker is a better coworker than you are, employee than you are, because why? Because I'm not saved by me being a good coworker, a good employee. I'm saved by the grace of God. What we're getting after is not that their actions themselves are not righteous. I would gladly admit that, and I think what you're getting after is true. But it is possible for unregenerate people to do morally good things, and if we wanted to instead appeal to the sovereignty of God or the providence of God, that God is using those good things to accomplish good things in the world. In which case is God pleased to use their evil deeds? I mean, we're saying they're evil from a God perspective, but from a human perspective, they're leading to human flourishing, right? There's plenty of charity organizations against human trafficking or against poverty or against hunger that are unregenerate people that are trying to do things for human flourishing, which is a good thing. The motives for why they're doing it are not good, but they're caring about other human beings, and they're attempting to do they're not meritorious. But would we say that God He's created to take care of His world, even in a sinful state as His enemy, still obeying that command? You're kind of against the rebellious heart that we are gladly admitting that He has. Does that make sense?
And certainly God sees the difference.
depravity, not a utter depravity. So, uh, and there's nothing that I do that would glorify God. But I'm doing everything. My motives for doing everything is to glorify myself, to make myself.
But it's not meritorious, because even when we as believers, try to do good, as R.C. Sproul there's a pound of flesh in all of it. We can't get away from it. Um, just because of who we are, the total depravity. But we, as sinners, might be totally and utterly depraved had it not been for the common grace of God in restraining evil in us and in the world. And that is the only way that anyone who's not saved can actually do something which is relatively good, is because of the common grace of God causing that to happen.
Yeah.
Everything that's, how did Fuller put it? I'm sure he was quoting some old ancient person, but he said all that is good is of the Creator. Let's see, start it the other way. All that is evil is of the creature, to him belongs the blame of it. All that is good is of the creature, to him belongs the praise of it.
Creator, yeah.
So if they can do something good, and it seems from our human perspective, as you said, that even sinners can do good that is not meritorious, that good that they do is only because God's grace is bringing it about. Even though it's not salvific grace, he's not necessarily saving all the sinners who do good. In fact, the more good a sinner does, the more difficult it seems to be to bring them into the kingdom. What was the verse? Something about, how does it say it? Something about the thieves and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom ahead of you, talking to the Pharisees.
Mm.
Wouldn't like God then by his grace use even the wicked to do his good? Like
To accomplish God's good?
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. To accomplish God's good.
Luther talks about this in his theology of work and grace, that when the psalmist talks about that God is providing for us all of our needs, right? Or when we pray the Lord's Prayer, like, give us this day our daily bread. How is God answering that prayer? He's answering it through the farmer. He's answering it through the mill worker. He's answering it through the delivery man. He's answering it through the grocer. He's answering it through the people who are producing fuel for you to have that bread that's now on your table, right? So
So would the results of that then be what's pleasing to God and not necessarily? Because
it's fine if you
obviously the
disagree,
man
Jeremy.
is
It's
not
fine, yeah.
pleasing to God.
okay.
I would, if he's outside of union through Christ, like I don't know that God can be pleased with that man.
Would you rather word it that God is pleased to use his deeds for God's glory?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there is, like, I think you might be thinking a little too much in a binary fashion. There is that where God is either pleased or he's not. But there's also like a spectrum of thinking when he deals with the nations. There are nations that were, in the Old Testament, that God said that they were so wicked that he was going to destroy them. He destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. The other cities he didn't destroy. So, while we don't want to say the people in the other cities were pleasing God, we can see that God was far more displeased with the cities that he destroyed or the countries he destroyed than the ones he left in place. And there is like a certain sense of civic morality where even countries that do not belong to God or do not are filled with people who don't believe in God, yet there's still that responsibility in the sight of God to act decently and in order and in accord with things like justice and that sort of thing, right? So that the sense of a country that does operate with a good sense of justice, you could say that that country in a sense is pleasing as far as looking at it on a spectrum kind of a thing. They're not so displeasing as the other country next to them that cares nothing at all for justice. But if it's something that not everyone agrees on either. There definitely is the traditional view that you can't do anything good, period.
Right.
And
In these countries that are that displeasing, God would have given up like those people.
At the same time, we see God use Babylon and Assyria and the Romans, who are wicked nations, to accomplish his purposes. And to actually using their wickedness, like using their vile way of dealing with in oppression, like he was using that vileness to punish his people. And
so they weren't given
so
up.
God is being pleased because justice is being served. But from a human standpoint, we're like, how do we deal with that? Because we're looking at wicked, vile people that are doing inhumane things, that are violating any sense of decency or just war theory that we've created. And God is using that for his glory and is pleased to do so because he's receiving justice from that.
Yeah, I agree. He does all things at his own pleasure.
Right.
every aspect of, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jack. Yeah.
All I was gonna say was, in reading the paragraph, I asked myself, why did he pick the word notorious, and not some other word? Is his meaning of that word different than what mine might be? And in the last sentence,
sinful person, or sinner rather, may be, like you said, an excellent spouse, but they may be doing it from the attitude of loving that other person more than they love themselves, and that may set them up to be a very excellent spouse, but they're not doing it out of a love for God more than anything else. So
Where's their pride? Their pride. I'm so proud that we have celebrated 35 years of marriage.
Right.
It's like,
well, let's say they didn't have any pride at all. Let's say they were absolutely a purely loving spouse to
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
wife or that husband, and they were the greatest spouse in the world in that sense, as far as as the world would judge things.
mhm.
But they had no love for God, so they were faithful. They were examples of marriage and such, which God said was good. But they're missing the most important part. And even if somebody could do something that would ordinarily be meritoriously good, if you already owe an infinite amount of debt, and then you do this one thing that's good, rebel against God, we rebel against Him in spirit and in falsehood. Mark, the verse listed there, Mark 7:21-23, is where Jesus says that out of the heart proceeds all manner of evil. It's not in the body. So sin as transgression, that's pretty easily understood, right? Adam, the first transgression,
Right.
Adam and Eve. God said, "Don't eat from the tree." They ate from it, and but what's strongly implicit in this is the ability to exercise one's will to obey or disobey. They made a choice. They chose to sin, and so that's transgression. And then we see in Romans 5:14, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the trespass of Adam, who was a type of him who was to come. But again, God destroyed the world by flood. So were there no transgressions?
Right.
They transgressed the law of God because they transgressed the law of God written on their hearts. They all knew what was wrong, and they transgressed it.
This is where, if you're familiar with the dispensational construct, that they would see innocence in the garden, and then human government goes from the garden to Moses. It's human government and then law, because
From the garden to Noah is
Thank you.
conscience.
conscience. Yes, thank
And
you.
from Noah to Moses is human government.
Thank you. I missed the conscience one. But yeah, understand that the law is specifically talking about Moses, And that comes into play as we move into number 34, that sin is a lack of conformity to law. Well, if the law doesn't come into written form, expressed form, until we get to Moses, how do we have sinners? How do we have God destroying the earth between Adam and Moses?
Because he has written the law on the hearts even of the Gentiles.
Exactly.
And,
Well, there were no Gentiles then.
Very true. Very true.
well, that just means that when you get to the point where you have Paul and you do have Gentiles, he's basically, if God's written his law on the hearts of the Gentiles as well as the Jews, that means everybody in the world God has written. Yeah.
Especially if you consider that Israel is meant to be a witness nation. Thought that they were perfectly obeyed it. They thought that they had beaten the law of God, like we've conquered this thing, and therefore, yes, we have earned salvation. And when we look at the law, rather, there's elements of grace that point us to Christ. And even Paul recognizes that the law was never able to save. It was always pointing us to Christ. It was always teaching us about who Christ was going to be, how he was going to bring salvation, because we couldn't perfectly keep the law. And even the law of our own conscience, if we set aside the 618 laws of the Jewish law, the law of our own conscience, everyone has broken. We saw that even last spring when we looked at Way of the Master, that Ray Comfort does that regularly, of just let's just work through the Ten Commandments. That's kind of a simple way of just looking at what's the law of your conscience, and how have you broken that, just very simply. You may have never read the Bible, but here's ways in which you've broken your own conscience.
And I remember long ago, I heard a interview with a Wycliffe Bible missionary, and they would go into places that had never been reached with the gospel before, and they would first learn their language, and then they would translate the Bible into their language, which I guess often meant actually developing an alphabet and teaching them to read and that sort of thing. But they said this one particular unreached group, that after they had stayed with them enough to learn the language, they asked their leader, "Can you explain to us the rules of your people?" And he said, "Well, the rules are simple," and he basically said, "Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, and honor your parents." And they had never been, reached before, but this sort of thing was built in and written on their hearts.
Yeah, absolutely. It's those sorts of things that I think is helpful for us, because we recognize that there is not salvation outside of Christ, and yet at the same time, we understand that there is condemnation to all men because of their conscience. And I'm going to reference C.T. Studd in the Message this morning, but he actually makes a statement that I don't reference, that all Christians should be engaged in missionary work, because we believe that anyone who dies without believing in Jesus is damned to hell. And if we actually believe that, then we should all be engaged in missionary work, trying to get as many people out of hell as possible through the grace of Jesus Christ. So, yeah, he's very passionate about that. As we look at the 4 types of death, just wrapping up here briefly, I thought this was helpful, just biblically speaking, looking at this, the physical death that every man suffers. It's pointing under man wants to die, and then comes the judgment. Spiritual death, which everyone also suffers outside of Jesus. And so we have the spiritual death that's only remedied through regeneration. And then there's the death coming under the impending judgment of God, and understanding his law and violating it. And then there's the second death, when God at the final judgment is going to condemn one to eternal torment. Even just discussing that with some of my pastor friends recently, of the idea of eternal torment, and how are the unregenerate resurrected into bodies that will suffer eternal torment. It's an incredible thought. We'll receive perfected bodies, and they'll receive bodies that are going to suffer.
But even now, people in hell who are not resurrected are suffering, and some people have said, well, that doesn't make sense. So they kind of reject it. They're like, you can't burn a spirit. Well, certainly the God who created all things and created the spirit can create a hell in which they will be suffering
Yes.
in it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts? Alrighty. Well, we'll look forward to discussing children and salvation next week. Thank you, guys.